Hey everyone, I'm DC Post President Selena Lowe, and it's my pleasure to invite you all to our virtual program. Thanks so much for joining in today. I do want to remind everyone to please mute your phones and type in your name and address in the chat box so that we can take attendance and you can receive your PDH certificates as well. Next slide. To start our meeting, I'd like to thank our Programs and Events Committee for putting this program together, who assisted with registration and advertising for this event. There's Bree Beal, our Programs Chair, and Philios Angelidis, and Kurt Maldovan, and Alison Yates. There's a lot of behind-the-scenes helpers to make this program and all our events successful. We couldn't do it with everyone on the DC board and all our committees, so definitely all your work is very much appreciated. We have a very excited program planned for you today. We've got over 150 attendees and an incredible panel of speakers, which is why I think everybody's taken time out to listen in for the very latest. Program today is Strategies for Success, Teaming and Joint Ventures, and the Small Business Administration Mentor-Protégé Program. Can't wait to begin this program, but let's start with a moment of silence to remember our active duty military and first responders and all who need our care and thoughts right now. Thanks very much. Now, please, I'd like to invite Daryl Stark to recite the Pledge of Allegiance for us. Daryl?
Thanks. And apologies if you hear the notifications. Don't know how to turn the sound off on the text box. But thank you, Selena. As Selena mentioned, my name is Daryl Starks. I'm the DC Young Members Director for this post. And if you would join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you.
I'd also like to thank the DC Post sponsors whose continued support allows us to maintain great programs and support the Post in our work with scholarship funds and outreach for young members, as Daryl represents. That's A. Morton Thomas, WSP, Alpha Corporation, Prime AE, Kaufman Engineers, Terracon, and Jacobs. Next slide, please. And love to welcome our new sustaining member firms, give them a shout out, Spiniello Companies and Maryland Energy Advisors. We truly appreciate your support. It helps us provide, great content for all our Post members and engage with industry and government, building resilient communities and connecting with our future leaders through our student and young members groups. We try to enrich the STEM pipeline and prepare our military and veterans for life after service. So thank you very much for your support, and certainly want to encourage you to be part of our programs for the future and learn more about what you're doing, in your various markets. Please visit our website for more information about sponsorship levels and how you can give back through your DC Post sponsorship. Next slide, please. Before we begin this program, I just want to remind you that you can receive an hour of professional development certificate. Just make sure that you put your name and address in the chat column of this program, and make sure you review the learning objectives before we begin. Now, I'd like to introduce you to our two panel speakers, Tony Anikeeff, who is the co-chair of Willams Mullen's government contracts practice. He represents domestic and foreign companies with federal and state governments, advising contractors, subcontractors, and third-party stakeholders regarding teaming and subcontracting. Also advising in mergers and acquisitions, set-asides, and small business issues. He also advises on financing and legal and advisory issues for compliance and training. He's testified as an expert witness and represented clients before various federal and state courts, including the Board of Contract Appeals and the General Accounting Office. He got his bachelor's degree from UVA and his law doctorate from College of William and Mary, and his Master of Laws from the school, LSE, London School of Economics and Political Science. We've also invited Lisa Wood. She's our statewide director for the Virginia PTAC, Procurement Technical Assistance Center, hosted by George Mason University. Prior to that, she served as a statewide director with Connecticut and Ohio PTAC programs and was director for the Northwest Commission PTAC office in Pennsylvania. Before joining the PTAC community, Lisa was a procurement specialist for the Bechtel plant machinery in the greater Pittsburgh area. In this role, she performed contract administration and negotiation duties. She holds an MBA from the University of New Haven and a BSBA through Robert Morris University of Pittsburgh, where she's also pursuing her PhD in instructional management and leadership. Let me now turn the program over to you, Tony and Lisa.
Right. Thank you so very much, Selena and Bree, for inviting Lisa Wood and myself to visit with you today. It's a real privilege to visit in a forum like this to talk about things like the nuts and bolts of a teaming agreement, because getting the basics right on these fundamental principles, one, makes life easier for everybody, and two, it allows you to focus on the substance of what you do on a day-to-day basis. And so with that, what are we going to talk about? The need to provide context and understanding about a teaming agreement is what we're going to talk about today. What are the circumstances when two or more companies might consider, and if appropriate, combine their resources to improve their offering to the government? As you can see from the agenda, we're going to unpack the nuts and bolts of teaming agreements, joint ventures, and how they come into play when dealing with the SBA's Small Business Mentor-Protégé Program. We're also going to talk a little bit about the strategy of how and why one considers teaming agreements and how they go about doing that. And then, like a hidden track on a CD, which of course reveals my age, we're going to touch briefly on the GSA's contractor teaming arrangements, which really aren't teaming agreements, but they're in that field. So my role today is going to be to lay the groundwork for what a teaming agreement is generally, and talk about what we'll talk about in terms of a vertical teaming agreement. I'm then going to turn the mic over to Lisa, who's going to talk about joint ventures and the Small Business Mentor-Protégé Program. So with that, let's turn to the next slide, please. Great. So the need for a program like this is generated by the many calls that Lisa and I get at our respective offices from companies that ask us, Lisa or Tony, can you just send us your standard teaming agreement? And we give pause because the challenge is there is no such thing as a standard teaming agreement or a standard joint venture, as we hope will become apparent through our program today. Indeed, the FAR, which, you know, it defines everything in the government contracts world, doesn't define a teaming agreement. A teaming agreement is really a written document that memorializes a contractor teaming arrangement. And that's what the FAR cares about. It defines and cares about what it refers to as a contractor teaming arrangement. And there are really two types. First, there's a vertical teaming agreement or teaming arrangement, and I will often slip up and call it a vertical teaming agreement. But a vertical teaming arrangement is a situation where two or more companies get together in an arrangement with one prime contractor and one or more subcontractors to pursue one of two things, either a single contract or pursue multiple contracts under a program. And the arrangements are a little bit different for each. The second type of contractor teaming arrangement is a horizontal teaming arrangement, which is known as a joint venture program. And that's what Lisa's going to talk about in a minute. But essentially, it's when, again, two or more companies get together and they form a partnership, an LLC, or a corporation to become its own prime contractor in pursuing one or more contracts or projects. The policy that pertains to all of this is the government loves teaming agreements. It favors them, it encourages them because that's the means by which they can get a better solution. The only thing that the government really cares about is that you disclose a teaming arrangement either when it's formed or prior to when it becomes effective. And that will take some note when we get into the Mentor-Protégé Program because the SBA is going to have to approve it. So you've got to go through the proper steps. With that, let's turn the slide and go on and let's get into the meat of this whole thing. But before I do need to distinguish one thing. A teaming agreement or a teaming arrangement is not a subcontract. It doesn't create a subcontract, although one of the goals of a teaming agreement is that one or more subcontracts will come out of it. The other thing that is not a teaming agreement or teaming arrangement is the GSA contractor teaming arrangement. The one thing I wanted to note for all of you is that the definition of subcontract in the FAR is not in the definition section. It's not in 2.101. It's buried back in section 44. And because of that, a lot of you who are vendors or suppliers of some kind on a government contract may overlook this definition, which I encourage you to review, because under the definition of a subcontractor, it includes vendors and suppliers, which are often entities that do not think of themselves as being a subcontractor and therefore not subject to the flow down provisions. With that caveat, let's move to the next slide and jump into the big question. And the big question is, now that we're thinking about the context, you know, the big question that every company needs to ask is whether and under what circumstances it should team in a particular situation. I know you all think it's overly lawyerly, but the answer is not necessarily, and it depends. What does it depend on? It depends really on who you are and what your circumstances are and what your goals are in reaching outside of your skill set. It depends on whether you're an experienced prime contractor, a big or a small company. What are your circumstances? And what are your ambitions? Usually, companies think about teaming when they lack something. They lack something in an effort to serve their existing customer, or they might want to expand into a new area. But before you go anywhere with teaming, you have to decide what your business goal is, and we'll talk about that in a minute, because if you don't have a business goal, you really can't go about dealing with a teaming agreement. Because when you approach this whole concept of teaming, you have to ask yourself, can you do it internally? Can you acquire the talent? Could you buy somebody, hire them? Can you go buy a company? Can you grow internally? Can you train somebody? What are the risks that you are taking on, and do you need to share it? What's your competition out there? Are you the only company out there? Are there others who can do what you do? And who are the folks out there? Can they help you? So when you take all of that and put it all in the stew pot, you know, the pros and cons fall into two categories. The pros can be defined as under the word expansion. You know, one teams because you might want to expand to a new market. You might want to expand your skill set to a customer. You might want to spread the risk a little bit. Or if you're really ambitious, you might want to test drive a potential acquisition target. All of this can be done through various forms of teaming. On the other hand, teaming is got some cons to it, and that comes under the concept of loss. When you team, you lose some control. You've got a teammate. They've got ambitions and business goals. You've got to rely on your teammate to perform. And if they fail, you fail. You also, if you succeed, may create a competitor who could become problematic down the road. So there are a lot of things to think about as one goes through this process that merits a little bit of effort. And with that, I think what we want to do is move on to the next slide, if we may. So having thought about the pros and cons, let's take a look at where teaming agreements fit into the procurement process. So we always get these calls about, can you send me a teaming agreement? Well, the key point is that a teaming agreement should come in at the end of the process. You know, you go to an SAME conference and you're sitting next to somebody and you hit it off and you go have some beers, or you may go to a basketball game, or you may play golf, and you may start talking about your companies, and all of a sudden the other person says, hey, let's team up and do something. Well, you know, the challenge here is that before you ever think of a teaming agreement, you have work to do. You have to decide what's your business goal. It's great that Joe wants to team up, but does that fit the business plan for your company? Right? If it doesn't, well, keep playing golf and don't team. Right? So what is your business goal and how are you going to go about it? And second, do you need to team? Right? Go back and think about whether that's something you can do. Then do some market research. Right? Go out on the internet and see who's out there. Right? What is the agency looking for? You know, have they been embedded with somebody for a long time? And whether you team or not, you're not going to win. Or maybe you got to go team with the company that's been the incumbent. Or maybe that incumbent, if you go check, has been protested a lot and's been in the base for 20 years. And they're doing a lousy job. So maybe you don't want to team with them. So there's that kind of consideration, right? And so after you do the market, I'll give an example. We're going to talk about this company A and B. There's a company out there that's really, it's not big, it's not small, it's middle-sized, but it's a leader in the field in this area of IT. It found out that a solicitation came out, and it's been trying to break into the field in the government and hasn't been able to do so. So it really is looking at the concept of teaming as a way to break in. Alas, the government issued the solicitation under a GWAC. There are 26 people on that GWAC. This company went and did its due diligence, which is the next thing you have to do. It went and did market research on all the companies. But then you've got to do due diligence. They went and did all the research you could do. They went on the internet. They looked up each of the companies. They interviewed each of the companies. They went on the SAM database. They checked the GAO protest record. They checked the court records, because to this contract means the world to them. At the end, they narrowed it down to 3 companies. They interviewed the companies again. And kind of like Goldilocks and the 3 Bears, one was an awful teammate, and they fortunately knocked them out. The other one was a little company. It was a little too new. And the third one was a good fit. We'll come back to them in a little bit later. So after you do the due diligence, you probably want to do an NDA. People often ask, can we have your standard NDA? Don't just use a standard NDA. Think about what you're trying to protect, how long it's going to last. Only then can you begin the process of a teaming agreement. And similarly, the joint venture, sometimes you go right to a joint venture or not, but often a teaming agreement precedes it. Why do you go through this effort? One of the reasons is that teaming agreements around the country are generally held to be unenforceable. In some states, they can be kind of enforced, but for the most part, the overall document may not be enforceable, although parts of it may be enforceable. So why are you going through that exercise? Well, what a teaming agreement primarily does is it creates a roadmap by which you and your other entities can submit a successful proposal to win a contract. And that is the first goal of a teaming agreement. The second goal, of course, is to get a subcontract, and that's where people often run into enforcement issues. But this is a situation where actually negotiating an agreement that may not be enforceable is helpful because it gets you to your first goal. It really, and we're going to talk about it in a minute, it sets out who does what the timelines are and things like that. And you're in that stage where everybody's trying to cooperate, so it's likely going to succeed. I will note that even if a teaming agreement is partially enforceable, it can have a great result. And I simply use an example, a recent example. 2 companies formed a teaming agreement. Company A was supposed to supply critical information to Company B. It unfortunately had an employee that made a very significant error. So Company A gave the information to B. It won the award. It got protested. It got protested successfully and lost the bid. So Company B sued Company A for fraud, breach of contract, and all sorts of other things for having failed in its obligations. It looked like an open and shut case that Company B was going to win hundreds of thousands to $1 million from Company A for its bad work under the teaming agreement. Company A had a good lawyer, not me, that had negotiated the teaming agreement. First, he knocked out the fraud on the grounds that it was covered by a teaming agreement and you can't have fraud in Virginia under a teaming agreement. And then he said that, well, under the teaming agreement, you only get a tiny little bit of money, $10,000 to $20,000 instead of the $300,000. So the subject of enforcement never came up, but it was successfully used to defend a company when things went bad. And with that, why don't we turn to the slide and talk about how to structure a teaming agreement? Okay, so we talked about the fact that there are no cookie cutter agreements, and it should be obvious based on what we've talked about that given the unique circumstances, there can't be a unique teaming agreement. It has to incorporate all the variables that come from being in a teaming situation. So the tension that occurs in a teaming agreement goes back to what I said depends on your circumstances. Are you big or small? Are you desperate? Do you have leverage? All of those kind of things come into play. If you want to think about general principles, prime contractors generally want a loose agreement. They want escape routes, off-ramps. They want the 60 days of negotiation and they can terminate, those kind of terms. The exception is if their proposed teammate, subcontractor, is critical to them and they're absolutely essential. That can turn the tables. A subcontractor generally wants to have a defined agreement, a guaranteed subcontract that it's part of the team. This too changes if the sub has unique talents and has many suitors. So this is all this negotiation that goes on to get to the end game. And I've already told you that the first end game, which can vary a little bit, but the first end game is to submit a successful proposal and get a contract, because without that, none of this matters. And so that part of the teaming agreement is really the nuts and bolts of what's going to happen prior to submitting a proposal. You know, those are the scope of work. Who's going to do what? What part of the proposal is the sub going to propose? Who does it have to commit to the team? How much investment does it need to make? What is the timing? Possibly what sanctions are if it's late. Whether it can talk to the customer. And this can become important in a situation where it's the subcontractor that actually brought the opportunity to the prime. You know, often the prime will say, hey, I'm the boss. I'm the only one that gets to talk to the customer. Not so necessarily if the sub brought the deal. And the sub that brings the deal, it has to think throughout the teaming agreement and the later subcontract, how is it going to preserve that leverage it has vis-a-vis the prime that's going to try and inch its way into that space and maybe take it over. At the end of the day, the other thing the sub needs to think about is it's going to make a significant investment, and it wants that investment to pay off because traditionally under teaming agreements, each party pays its own cost. And then what happens if there's a breach? Well, I just told you of that example of what happens if there's a breach. The enforceability of a teaming agreement when you don't do your work is often not questioned. But the limitation of liability, the fact that you have an agreement, all are terms that may come into play if there's a breach of that initial obligation to do what you agreed to do under the teaming agreement. So the second end goal is to come up with a subcontract that will carry forward to do the work, or a series of subcontracts. And it's important to note that usually or often people are going after a single subcontract. And that's fine. You do a teaming agreement, you get a subcontractor, you enter into a joint venture agreement, you do the project, and it's over. The teaming agreement will end when you enter into that subcontract. If you're doing something different, you've teamed up to go after an agency program that may have a series of contracts, you have to alter that teaming agreement a bit because it will end with respect to each subcontract, but the teaming agreement itself will continue until the program's over or until some defined date. But this is where teaming agreements run into the enforceability problem. And the reason they run into an enforceability problem is courts look at them and say they're merely, quote, an agreement to agree, rather than a defined contractual agreement. And why is it that they become or deemed to be agreements to agree? Well, if you look at most teaming agreements, they don't have a subcontract attached to them. They don't clearly define the statement of work, and they don't have a defined price. And then they have that awful clause in them that says, in the termination section, we can terminate this teaming agreement if we negotiate for 60 days and fail to come to an agreement. It's an unfortunate solution. And so what's the solution? And this is really from the prime contractor side, subcontractor side. How do you make them more enforceable? And the way you make them enforceable is to impose as much definity or definition into the agreement as possible. And where do you do that? My favorite place to do it is in the preamble. Those whereas clauses that everybody sees on agreements and ignore, that's my favorite part of the agreement. Because in that whereas clause, you can go into as much detail about yourself as you want. You can get the other party to agree that you are the world's best nut maker, or the world's best bolt maker, or the world's best sushi maker, and that they will commit to entering into a subcontract and do all that in the preamble. That kind of hooks them in. Then you go and you try and talk about the statement of work, right? You should be able to come up with the statement of work that's going to go into the subcontract. How much of the work are you going to get when a subcontract's awarded? And then can you come up with a price? If you can't come up with a price, is there some way that you can come up to a range of a price and establish an objective standard that will allow you to set price through some objective means? And then there's things like exclusivity. Can you guarantee that your partner does not have the right to go off and team with somebody else? Or on the other side, how do you protect the right that if you decide in the middle of this teaming agreement that this is awful, you can get out of the deal? How long is it going to last? I talked about that a minute ago. Teaming agreements usually last for a year or two, and they end when a subcontract's entered into, or they end when a series of subcontracts entered into. The problem you have to get around is that clause that says, if we negotiate for 60 days, we can walk. Take it out if you can. It's pretty hard to do. Put a clause in there that says that the prime contractor will enter into a subcontract at the end of negotiation. And if they can't, we'll agree to mediation or to arbitration. Things like that increase the enforceability of doing something like that. Then you can try and build in some remedies. They're hard to do, but you can try and build in liquidated damages if there isn't a contract. I will tell you, and I know Lisa has, we've both tried to insert those into teaming agreements, and I'm batting zero. For some reason, the other party never wants to do it. You can also think about trying to create a constructive trust and other things like that to try and deal with enforceability. And then there's some other terms, and these are what people think of as boilerplate, but there's some critical ones. The one that I focus on that people often forget is in the boilerplate, there is usually something called the headings paragraph. And it says that headings are not a material part of the contract and they're just there for convenience. I always add to that and call it the recitals and headings clause and make a point to say that recitals are a substantive part of the contract. I'll go back to this recent contract we had where the newbie is coming in and it's teaming up with this established member. When we were negotiating the teaming agreement, we really beefed up the recitals, and we put that recitals clause into the boilerplate. And the big company came back and said, not on your life. We aren't going to have that clause in there. And we're not going to have any of your happy-go-lucky clauses in the recital. But this is what they said. We won't put it in writing, but we will commit on the telephone today that you will get a subcontract and we will treat you fairly. But we have lots of teaming agreements. We have lots of subcontractors, and we can't have one of our teaming partners come up with some unique thing that somebody else might use against us down the road. That's kind of the realities that you hit. And so what are the other terms? Continuing your customer relations. What's the governing law? If you use the law of Virginia, DC, or Maryland, the fact is that there's a good chance that the entire agreement won't be declared enforceable, but various clauses might be declared enforceable. If you happen to be able to use the law of California, you got a pretty good chance that a teaming agreement might be declared enforceable. And if you use New York, it's kind of in the middle, subject to negotiation. You need to check your confidentiality clause, because when you did the NDA for the teaming agreement, you want to make sure it still applies. So I'm just giving you a reality check on the world. Despite everything that Tony tells you or Lisa tells you, You know, you might get a big company that's just not going to play by the rules, and they're going to use their leverage. Use the teaming agreement as a further act of due diligence. If the teaming agreement process is excruciating, it may be the subcontract experience is excruciating, because the fact is there are good companies out there and bad companies out there. And there's some you want to do business with and some you don't. And the teaming agreement may be the last opportunity you have to get out of a deal that looks like it's going south. And I can tell you that a company recently that did a teaming agreement that had that 60-day clause, it, I think, mistakenly invested $100,000 pre-subcontract in getting ready for the subcontract it's sure it was going to get. And on the 61st day, the prime called them up and said, nah, we're not going to do it. Goodbye. And they called us. That's the first time they ever called us. And we had to say, look, you know, you could have done something before this, but not. Then the question is should I have a teaming agreement at all? And I go back to 3 sisters I met about 10 years ago who came to our office, and they had entered into a subcontract with a big contractor. And 6 months into the contract, they hadn't got a dime of work. And yet the proposal, which I saw, had their name all over it. So the first agreement was, I said, well, what did you do in your teaming agreement? Silence. What's a teaming agreement? They didn't have one. So there's a reason to go through a teaming agreement. It will work out to the extent that you put the effort in. Sometimes it won't work out, sometimes it will, but it is a great roadmap that helps you get to goal 1 and then to goal 2. And on that happy note, I think we turn the slide and I turn over the program to Lisa to talk about joint ventures and the small business program.
Thank you, Tony. Lisa Wood here. So now we're going to switch gears and we're going to talk about joint ventures. So joint ventures themselves are actually a legal agreement where 2 entities become a new entity. So it's like 2 entities give birth to a new business. So just remember, that's the difference where you're teaming. That's why it's called vertical and horizontal. So you're doing something that 2 people are coming together. So why would you enter into a joint venture? So a joint venture enables you to use resources and skills for a common goal. So some key advantages to a joint venture is that both businesses are really incentivized to work hard and succeed, since you both share in the end result. Each business contributes their resources and skills rather than spending money to purchase those resources and skills that were required to develop the end result. Each business creates the end results and grows more quickly than it would if it had tried to do that job by themselves. So you're sharing time, costs, and risks with your joint venture partner. So some disadvantages to the joint venture, and yes, there are disadvantages. So remember, this is a business relationship, and if it's well planned and well documented, chances are it's going to succeed. However, if it's not well planned or not well documented, you may have misunderstandings about what skills and resources you will each contribute. You may have disagreements on the speed of work and the time frame that work's going to be done. You could have conflicting goals and priorities. You may not have legal rights to what you've developed, and you may waste a considerable amount of time and money and then face a costly legal dispute because you guys aren't getting along. Some other considerations would be cultural differences, conflicting styles of leadership, and no real blueprint for a sustainable strategy. So we're going to talk about this later on in a few more slides on how you can mitigate some of these disadvantages by having a really thorough JV done up. Next slide, please. So when an offer is a small business joint venture, the procuring agency is required, and I repeat, required, to consider the past performance and experience of the joint venture members. So before, there was an issue with some contracting officers. They were looking for past performance of the joint venture itself. Well, what joint venture is newly born that has past performance? It has to rely on the past performance of the members of the joint venture. So that being said, small business offers currently have to scrutinize each solicitation to determine whether it requires officers to possess clearances, capabilities, certifications, and so forth in their own names, or whether they may rely on other entities to meet those requirements. If the solicitation is unfavorable to them in that respect, then they have to advocate for a discretionary solicitation amendment or rethink their structure, or possibly not submit a proposal at all. This is particularly weighty in consideration of math-based evaluations where each reference or qualification may be scrutinized. So you really need to read the solicitation and be careful of how it's being called out. They are mandated now to consider past performances, but there's other issues like facilities clearances. So please make sure you're reading that solicitation and following up with anything that might be contrary to what you believe would be a good fit for your JV. Next slide, please. There's no real boilerplate JV agreement, and each are unique. However, there are some areas that must be addressed in order to avoid problems down the road. Communication is everything. A joint venture agreement is a legal agreement to formalize the understanding between the parties. A well-drafted joint venture agreement sets out all the terms and conditions between the parties, including what you're each going to contribute, time frames, milestones, management of the joint venture, because like I said, styles of leadership can differ widely. Include how you're going to work together. Consider prior intellectual property and what intellectual property each party is bringing to the table. The party who brings it should own it. You generally do not want to give up ownership to the other parties. Remember, these can go bad, so make sure you're really careful about your stuff. Developed intellectual property, you need to consider that as well. What's going to be developed during that joint venture and who will own it in the end? The joint venture is not a legal entity like a company. The joint venture cannot own intellectual property. In theory, it can be jointly owned between the joint venture parties. In practice, it is generally considered more prudent to have each business own the intellectual property that they develop, with licenses to use that intellectual property for the joint venture. You also need to consider cost sharing, profit sharing, liability, that's huge. If things go wrong, who's going to take the blame? And dispute resolution. Even if the joint venture does not succeed as well as you had hoped, a well-drafted dispute resolution can give you an orderly exit rather than conflict and losing a costly dispute in the courts. Next slide, please. So, Mentor-Protégé Program. As of November 16th, 2020, the 8A Mentor-Protégé Program and the All Small Mentor-Protégé Program have merged into one SBA Mentor-Protégé Program. And that's funny because I just had a question the other day. Somebody said to me, well, I understand now 8A doesn't exist, that they merged it into Mentor-Protégé. I said, no, you're not reading that correctly. It just means 8A will no longer have their own special mentor-protege program that it's being merged into All Small because it is an administrative burden on SBA. So this program helps eligible businesses, the proteges, gain capacity and win government contracts through partnerships with more experienced companies who are the mentors. This also provides a great way for a small firm to partner with a large entity and avoid the fear of affiliation. Next slide. Some of the benefits the mentors may provide the protege would be management and technical assistance, financial, contracting, business development assistance, as well as general and administrative assistance and trade education. In return, the mentor is able to participate in contracting opportunities that would not have been possible, such as small business and socioeconomic set-asides. So everyone says to me, well, what's in it for the mentor? Well, that mentor, it could be an exited 8A who can no longer participate in 8A set-asides. But if they mentor a brand new baby 8A firm, now they get a chance to still participate in those 8A opportunities. So these joint ventures would qualify for set-aside contracts that the small businesses are eligible for, including contracts set aside for, of course, 8A, service disabled veteran, woman-owned, and hub zone businesses. Next slide. To qualify as a protege, you must be small, of course, with industry experience. Have a proposed mentor prior to applying for the program. You can have no more than 2 mentors in your business's lifetime. You need to be organized for profit or as an agriculture cooperative. To qualify as a mentor, you must be capable of carrying out the responsibilities to assist the protege firm, possess good character, and not be on the federal list of debarred or suspended contractors, and impart value to the protege firm due to lessons that you've learned and practical experience gained or through its knowledge of general business operations and government contracting. The mentor cannot have more than 3 proteges at one time and must clearly demonstrate that there's no legal conflict of interest, meaning none of the proteges are competitors to each other. For the order for the SBA to approve the mentor-protege agreement, the SBA must determine that the mentor provided assistance and will promote real development gains for the protege, not just an act as a vehicle to receive federal small business set-asides. They've got to have skin in the game. They have to show that we're actually going to help this firm succeed and grow their business. And the SBA has a determination of affiliation, and this must not exist between the mentor and protege. So businesses are considered affiliates when one party has the power to control the other, or a third party or parties control or has the power to control both. It does not matter whether control is exercised, so long as the potential to control exists. SBA considers factors such as ownership, management, previous relationships with or ties to another concern, and contractual relationships in determining whether that affiliation exists. So a mentor-protege is sort of a free pass on affiliation, but there's still some areas of affiliation you need to consider. You just want to make sure that you're not getting caught up in something that's going to create a bid protest when you go to bid on your first opportunity. So also remember, SBA does not assist with matching the protege to the mentor. The mentor and protege should already have formed a relationship with each other before applying. You must be approved by the SBA to participate in the mentor-protege program. You're required to use the certified.sba.gov website in order to apply. You'll need to have a profile, sam.gov, before you can use the certification website. Before you apply, make sure both businesses are, of course, registered in SAM. You have to have your NAICS codes clearly defined and on hand. Both businesses must complete the SBA's online tutorial. And this is critical. And you might think it's silly, like, why do I have to go take a quiz or a test? But it really does help you determine whether this is a good fit for you. So you both need to take it and take it individually, because you're going to get a certificate of completion. That certificate of completion is going to be needed when you go to apply. You're going to have to upload those certificates. You need to create and agree to a mentor-protege agreement. Now, the SBA provides a boilerplate one, but I recommend using your own attorney and your own agreement, and make sure it's an attorney that understands government contracting and knows what mentor-protege is. So don't listen to a mentor saying, oh, save money, just use my attorney and it will be a lot easier. No, don't do that. I've seen some really bad things happen because somebody shared an attorney. So when you're ready to apply, you go to the certified.sba.gov and apply to join the Mentor-Protégé program using the Protégé's DUNS number. Read the instructions carefully to make sure you provide all the necessary information. Their organization is everything here. You want to make sure everything is loaded and ready to go. It will be quick, it will be easy, and it will save time in the screening and processing, which takes about 105 days. So if you miss something or it's not signed or dated or not compliant, they're going to come back with deficiencies and you're going to have to remedy, and that remedy takes time. So what was 105 days might turn into 120 days. So you really have to be organized and careful and prepared when you're submitting this application. So a mentor-protege agreement may last up to 6 years. A protege may have 2 mentors at the same time as long as those relationships don't conflict or compete with each other. However, a protege cannot have no more than 2 mentors over the life of the business. You must maintain the mentor-protege relationship after the SBA approves your agreement. Annual evaluations are required so SBA can track progress and document benefits, so the protege can maintain eligibility in the program through compliance. Non-compliance will result in a termination, and I've seen it happen. They fail to do the annual reports. They fail to show that they're actually doing what was called out in the agreement, and SBA will pull the plug. SBA relies on the annual evaluation report to determine if businesses continue to participate in the program. If a protege does not complete its annual evaluation, the SBA may terminate, of course, the agreement. A protege may request SBA to intervene on its behalf with the mentor if it believes it is not receiving the assistance promised by the mentor, or if it thinks that the assistance provided was not of the quality it anticipated. And I've seen that go as well, that the protege feels as though they're just being taken advantage of, that the mentor just came on as a free ride to participate in set-asides and small business opportunities that they couldn't bid on themselves. And they're not offering the protege the work and the assistance that was the original agreement. So you want to make sure you are clearly showing that you are helping the protege with their business. And proteges, you need to make sure the mentor is fulfilling their obligation. Next slide, please. So we're going to switch gears here a little bit. This is the GSA's CTA, which is a contractor teaming arrangement. And a lot of you may not even be aware that this exists. But under a CTA, 2 or more GSA schedule holders, they both have to own schedules. They work together to meet the needs of an order activity, meaning any agency or organization that can order from a GSA schedule. This is not the formation of a new company like a JV, but it's 2 firms working together and allows those 2 firms to compete for orders for which they may not qualify for on their own. So you've got the aspect here of a teaming agreement. This helps the government get a total solution by contractors who offer complementary products and services. This also helps satisfy agency socioeconomic goals, so government loves this. In order to qualify for a CTA, both parties must be schedule holders. Each member is responsible for the duties addressed in the CTA. Each team member has privity of contract, which I love because this allows them to interact directly with the government. The buying entity is also invoiced at each team member's unit price or hourly rate as called out in the task or delivery order or the GS schedule BPA. Opportunities which may have been impossible for an individual schedule holder become possible under a CTA. This is a great way to grow your business. So if you are currently a schedule holder, I would be out there on the GSAE library, and I would be finding people who are potential teaming partners, because I think this is a great way to get higher dollar value procurements that are also more complex and build past performance. Next slide, please. So I guess, Anthony, we're open for questions.
We are. We'll turn it back to Celine, I guess, to tee them up for us.
I was going to encourage people to either chime in with a question or type one out. I'm sure I've taken so many notes that I'm actually so glad this is being recorded. You know, I also encourage, I know we have in attendance some people from the government sector. If you have some questions as well, I encourage you to ask them or get in touch with Tony and Lisa afterwards, because I think there's two sides of the coins here. I guess to go back to the enforceable topic of, you know, enforcing or unenforcing, and I'm very guilty in the past of probably glossing over teaming agreements, but you know, without an enforceable feature in it, why would I bother? What you know, what would you say?
I'll take that one on, because it's a question after we go through all of this that people ask, and the fact is that, you know, if two businesses come together that haven't done business before, or even if they have, you kind of want to set the rules for what's going to be your arrangement. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, I've said it depends whether you need a teaming agreement. You could do a memorandum of understanding. You could write letters to each other. You mm-hmm. don't need to do a teaming agreement, but a teaming agreement is a good form to set the roadmap for what you, Company A and Company B, are going to do to get to goal one, which is to put together a proposal that has the greatest chance of success. And the number of people that successfully team and submit proposals, you know, makes it a good reason to go ahead and do that. That varies a little bit from, you know, the normal argument of you only do agreements for things that go wrong. Well, this is a reason to do agreement for when you're in the kumbaya stage, to sort of set out the roadmap. And even if it ultimately proves unenforceable, which usually it's only going to be partly unenforceable, it's a great thing to do.
I think you've definitely demonstrated the value of that, Tony. You know, I've just never really had an in-depth discussion about it in the past. How about doing some true or false, a true or false scenario? Must the mentor be other than small?
No, a mentor can also be a small. They don't have to be large.
That's right. You're talking about the AA and then the non-AA, but could be both be small.
Yes, a mentor can be small. Mentor does not have to be an other than small.
Okay. On the joint venture topic, true or false? The JV cannot have any employees of its own.
They are a joint venture is unpopulated. However, they just made a new ruling in the regards to facility clearances, and this is a whole complicated thing. So both of the partners of a joint venture can have their facility clearances, but once again, the contracting officers say that, well, you need to have a facility clearance for the joint venture, but they don't have to do that any longer. They are allowed to hire a facility clearance officer for the joint venture. So that is the one outlier when it comes to the unpopulated thing. They can bring on a facility clearance officer just so they can pursue that facility clearance. But they are permitted to cover their facility clearances. If let's say one has a facility clearance, they have to do the work that requires a facility clearance, and the other party cannot. So that's a common misconception with mentor-protege. Some proteges think, well, my mentor has a facilities clearance, I can piggyback on that. And that's not true. That they can't do any of the work that requires a facility clearance. The mentor who has the clearance has to do that work, but they can win the work. It's just the uncovered part of the partnership cannot do the work that requires the facility clearance.
Yeah, let me just add one thing, because it often gets glossed over, and we could talk about it forever, is the concept of populated versus unpopulated. So a populated joint venture is one where the joint venture hires its own employees. Unpopulated means that it generally doesn't have its own employees. As Lisa said, there's an exception for an FSO. You also can hire an administrative person to do some of the paperwork. The SBA recently, or a few years ago, said that joint ventures under the SBA Mentor-Protégé Program have to be unpopulated. So basically, the joint venture is the legal entity that's the prime contractor, but it depends on the technical staff of its members to do the work.
Got it. Thank you, Tony and Lisa. True or false? The Small Business Administration must pre-approve the JV operating agreement. Is that up to the SBA?
They used to, but in the new ruling, they no longer need to approve the JV prior to the award, but it has to be approved before it actually was awarded. So in order for them to bid, it doesn't have to be approved. But if they're the apparent awardee, it has to be approved.
If they, in the event that they are the successful submission, is that what you're saying?
Yes. So you don't have to go to the SBA every time you want to start a joint venture. But if you're going in and bidding on something as a joint venture and you're the apparent awardee, it must be approved by the SBA.
That's an interesting milestone to get to.
So there's one little addition here. One doesn't have to get JVs approved, but one has to get the Mentor-Protégé agreement approved. And so often those are a combined document. I'm getting a little technical on the legal side, but yeah, you can go set up your JV if you wish, but then you need to get your Mentor-Protégé chopped off by the SBA.
Okay, thank you. And the last true or false challenge, the joint venture takes on the identity of the protege? Or how is that true or false?
Yes, in the mentor-protege, the protege is the prime. They're the lead. So it takes on the socioeconomic and size of the partnership. That's why it's so desirable for a mentor, because they're able to bid on set-asides and opportunities that they couldn't as a standalone organization.
That's right.
Yeah. Let me put a little gloss on that, because while you get the kind of the benefits of the small business, the joint venture is a legal entity. So most companies that form joint ventures today create an LLC as opposed to a partnership or a corporation. So, you've got company A and company B that form a joint venture, Charlie Company. Charlie Company is the prime contractor, and that is who does the contract, and that's who gets paid, and that's who shows up. but it's comprised of A and B. And if A is the little company, you know, the joint venture in that instance gets the character and the benefits of the little company. But it's still a separate legal entity with a right to sue and be sued and be terminated and all that goes with it. As opposed to, and one of the protections is that by being a joint venture, if something goes wrong and it gets terminated, it's not the member companies that get terminated, it's the joint venture. So it's important that it's a separate legal entity.
Absolutely, absolutely. I see we have some written questions. Thank you for those. I'll read them out in a minute. Does anybody actually want to just ask a question? This would be a good time.
This is Luis.
Yes, Luis, I see. Go ahead.
Yes. My question is, my entity is Concierge Business Solutions out of Georgia. I'm in the construction field. And my question will be, is there a percentage or minimum profit sharing that the protege must make on these agreements, so it's not total pass through or you guys, that's kind of my question summary.
Tony, I'll handle that over to you.
Oh, okay, thanks.
For profit.
So yeah, so in order to have a small business arrangement, the majority has to be controlled. It has to be run by the small business. It has to get a majority of the profits. The work split can be 60-40. It gets a little bit complicated because the big company can invest up to 40% in equity into the company, but it can't take a majority of the profits out of the deal. But it can get a return on the equity it's invested. It can get return on the investment money that it's lended. So there's a variety of ways to get its money back, but it's not allowed to take 50% or more.
Thank you.
I want to address Robert Carlson's question. Can the mentee participate in 2 mentor-protégé programs at once, or must they be sequential?
No, yes, you can do 2 at the same time, as long as they aren't in the same area of expertise. They're not in the same NEX code, because now you have a conflict of interest. So you have 2 proteges doing the same thing. They cannot mentor both. They need to mentor somebody in a more diverse area of expertise. So, for example, one protege might be IT, the other protege will say construction. So they can't have like proteges at the same time, but they can have 2.
That sounds.
The mentee can be in 2 programs at once.
Okay.
Yes, this is Robert. That was my question. As the small business, can you be in 2 mentor-protege programs at once? And then am I hearing that you would have to be in a different NACE code, or you could be in the same NACE code with 2 different large companies?
Lisa, you can. My input on that is you can be in 2 programs because you're allowed to have 2 mentors. I'm not sure whether you can be in the same NAICS code. I don't see any reason why not. You might find yourself in an awkward situation if you do that, though.
Right. There's going to be some perceived conflict of interest. So you have to be very careful with that. You can have 2 mentors, but if you go out to competition, well, there's an opportunity. You can't bid against yourself. So it's all, you have to think about the ramifications of having two mentors. You can have two mentors over the life of the program, but having two at the same time, that's not going to work.
That sounds like something that you need to delve into specifically and in more detail.
Yeah.
Thank you for that, Robert. Jim Miles, you had a question regarding the 60-40 split on the mentor-protege JV. Does that mean the protege can sub out 60% of the work to the mentor on a revenue basis? Yes. Affirmative. Okay. Sharon's question, does the mentor and protege have to be performing in the same primary NAICS codes? Does that mean the two companies have to share the same?
No. And to clarify earlier, the protege can have no more than two mentors in the business's lifetime. So they can be in one mentor-protege program, and when that's done, they can go into another mentor-protege program. So two mentors in a lifetime, but a protege cannot have them at the same time, because once again, you could end up conceivably bidding against yourself, one through one mentor and one through another mentor. So to avoid that, you can have two mentors, but it would have to be one after the other, not at the same time.
Well, one thing I might add to that is, most companies operate in a particular NAICS code, but they often have a secondary NAICS code. So if you operated in two fields, electronics and marine works, in theory, you can always ask the SBA for approval. Whether they grant it or not is a different thing. But if you were in diverse areas, the SBA might allow you to have different mentors in those different NAICS codes. But Lisa's right. I think if you tried to get two mentors on the same NAICS code, it would be horrific, and you'd buy yourself a lawsuit from one of them.
Exactly. So you wouldn't want let's say an IT firm mentor is not going to take on a protege who's in construction. The SBA is never going to buy that. That you need to have a justification narrative as to how this works. How are you going to help this protege if you're not even in the same area of business? So it has to be complementary.
Yeah, I have a question for that, but I want to get on to Cal. Hi, Cal.
Hi, how are you? Thank you.
Cal, you had a question. If two firms have formed a new entity, how can they use past performance of one of the two firms so that selection committees of the owner agency will accept past performance? You mean just accept past performance of mostly one company? Or
Yeah, I think the issue we have, it's not really entity between the two firms. I didn't put it right. This is entity between an individual and the company. Individual is a 51% owner, being a service disabled owned company. And the company.
Who is one person, you mean?
Yeah, one person and the company.
Okay.
And when the company uses its past performance, usually that sees the C parts of the past performance of the company, and the agency reviewing the proposal will say, oh, this is not the experience of the new entity. Even though explain it right in the beginning of our cover letter, this entity is between a person and the company, and the person is a 51% owner and the company is 49% owner.
Under the new rules that just became rule in October, November of 2020, contracting officers must consider the past performance of both parties of a joint venture. Not that the joint venture itself is not going to have past performance, most likely, especially if it's brand new.
Yeah.
So they are required to consider past performance of both or one of the parties.
One of the issue we have in that circumstance is we don't put joint venture at the end of our company, you know. We have a new entity in Maryland. If you make the joint venture, then MDOT don't qualify you as another entity. So it's a joint venture. We don't certify, you know. So it is an LLC. So I don't know how to, you know, we go to the debriefing, they said, oh, we did not accept your past performance. And also the projects we submitted as a past performance, we put it clearly that this project was completed by the firm or one of the partner of the LLC.
Well, each state has its own procurement rules and regulations. So you would need to address that with the state, but on a federal standard, they have to consider the past performance of both or one of the partners as it's applicable to the particular procurement. But for state, yeah, each state has a different view of how they work procurement.
Now, the issue we have with the federal agencies, because I was saying because our name of the entity does not say JV. And
you're in SAM as a joint venture.
It's as a joint venture? Okay.
Yes. So you've entered your new joint venture in SAM with its own cage code. It is a separate entity.
Yes.
So they have to consider the past performance of both parties. That is a requirement as of the past NDA rules.
And,
do you
and
have that reference number or something, this new rule?
Yeah, I could get that to you.
Okay.
Good luck, Cal. Yeah.
The failure to follow the FAR is a grounds for protest.
Okay, thank you.
May I, Jacqueline, you've got your hand up, and then we'll go to Andrew. Jacqueline, are you there?
Yes, I am. Can you hear
Hey.
me? How are you? So the question, I had also typed it in the chat. I see that so we have recently applied for an MP, and the model JV agreement that they had that you could download listed a specific solicitation number. So my question is it the intent, if you're in an MP, that the JV be for a specific solicitation? Because I also saw that they have an amendment that you can download. So is the intent that it's per solicitation and then you amend it per solicitation, or is there a way to model it to be more broad? That's my question.
I really couldn't hear the question for some reason. I'm sorry.
Well, Jacqueline, Jacqueline, if you could try it again and turn up your volume, but she's written down her question. Can you see it?
Can you hear me now?
Bit better, yeah.
Okay, let me try it again. So basically what I was asking is we recently applied for an MP, we're waiting to hear, but I saw when we downloaded the model JV agreement that they put a location where you're supposed to list a solicitation number. So my question is the intent of the JV to be per solicitation and then you amend it for each solicitation, or is there a way to have it be more broad? And I was curious if the model that they have you download is written that way, perhaps to avoid, potential disputes for affiliation or things like that.
So, yeah, Lisa, I don't know. I first of all would only use the model just to have a glance at it and do your own. But the Mentor-Protégé Program will back up. You can create a joint venture for any reason, and it can be for a series of contracts. If you're applying to the Mentor-Protégé Program, you probably are applying for a particular solicitation. It doesn't necessarily need to change if you decide to go after another contract.
Okay, so you don't have to amend it per every solicitation. They just make you list one just to apply.
I think so. Lisa, do you? I mean, once you create the joint venture, you've set up the relationship between the parties, and that's likely not going to change. There would be nothing to stop you, however, if you did another solicitation with the joint venture and the circumstances were to change, there's nothing to stop you from amending it if you wanted to. It's your agreement.
Right, but it's not a requirement. You're not going to change it for every solicitation that you bid on.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. Just in the interest of time, Andrew, would you like to go next?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yes. Being a small promotional product company, looking for a mentor, how are we supposed to go about finding one? And one, can suppliers actually be a mentor?
Can suppliers be a mentor?
Yes.
If a supplier is experienced in government contracting, I'd say they would be a good mentor, but you really have to put a lot of thought into who is going to mentor you. Like, what are they bringing to the table? You know what you're bringing. What are they bringing? Are they really going to be able to give you the assistance, technical assistance, government contracting assistance, financial assistance that is required? So you just don't want somebody saying, yeah, I want to be your mentor so I can take advantage of all those juicy small business set-asides. So you just need to ask. Normally it's somebody who may be a competitor who has a demonstrated history of being successful in government contracting. You want somebody you're really going to be able to learn from. So be very careful in who you choose to ask to be your mentor. They have to understand all the responsibilities of being that. But if that supplier has experience in government contracting, then yeah, I mean, go ahead and ask them. But of course, they have to be in SAM. They have to have all the right things in place in order to be a qualified mentor.
Yeah.
Right.
And-
So who do I mean, I'm new to this, so who do I talk with? How do I find the information about who can become mentor? Because I look at the some of the sites and it says GSA member or something like that.
So yeah, this is a marketing question. So the SBA
I'm
maintains
local PTAC.
Yeah, I was going to say call Lisa. The SBA also maintains lists of contractors, and Dr. Google is a fine way to look for companies that are in your industry. That's called market research, which, all of this goes back to you. Do you want to be in business with these people? And so it takes time and effort, and talking to Lisa, she can give you a lot of tips, although I don't think she can give you too much business advice or legal advice or business advice. But she can certainly point you in that direction. And the SBA has lists of contractors that are looking for subs. And then there's every agency, if you pick an agency, has an office of the small business office, and you can contact them, and they may be of assistance, although the level of assistance they provide, varies with the agency and the personnel involved. Some are outstanding, some are a little less so.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways to do market research on finding a potential mentor. There's USAspending.gov, there's Federal Procurement Data Systems, there's the Dynamic Small Business Search. There is just people in your own field that you know of that you could research to just make sure. And then you just ask. You write a nice letter and say, hey, would you like to be my mentor? But you'd have to send them your capability statement and show them what a good catch you are. It's like eHarmony of government contracting.
I didn't say that. I didn't bring up going to the prom either, but anyway.
And I wanted to add that I put in the chat the link to the CFR note that talks about the requirement for past performance in a joint venture. So it's very clear that they are required to consider the past performance and experience of the joint venture members, including any large business mentors in a joint venture.
Well, good luck, Andrew. And you know, we're coming to the end of our program, and I do want to encourage everybody to, you know, to get in touch with Lisa and Tony with your questions, especially, you know, this has been a very fruitful hour, and you know, there's a few more questions to get through. I see that Cheryl has a question. Are you there, Cheryl? Is it possible for a government agency to only consider all small JVs, meaning JVs formed with only small businesses versus JVs with a, I don't know what an OTSB is, something small business?
Other
Yes.
than small business.
Other than small business, yes.
Yeah, so the basis of that question, there's a high profile small business best of class GWAC draft out there that literally in the instructions state that only joint ventures formed with only small businesses. So it seems to be that they are not considering joint ventures that are formed with even the mentor-protégé with large businesses or other than small. And I know that Lisa provided the CFR language that says requirements for, you know, JV consideration. So I was just trying to see if that was in conflict, or do you think it's just that they can further define which small joint ventures, and then once they identify which joint ventures they want, they have to include their past performance, experience, etc. I hope that was clear, and I can re-articulate that if possible.
So what schedule was this for? What's the best in class?
Yeah, it's Polaris. It's a small
Polaris.
business GWACs. Yeah, that's replacing Alliant to small business.
Yeah,
That's brand new.
they're pretty rigid. The Polaris proposal is pretty rigid, and they have the right to call out what they want.
Yeah, the government has the right to buy what it wants in the way that it wants, and it can set up a procurement for all small business. It's a little unusual to mandate that you have to be an all small joint venture. I'd assume that some small business could bid on its own, but they're basically saying we want small businesses to do it. One thing to consider, and it might come into the area, GSA is currently considering a new, very broad-scaled schedule. It's kind of a new age thing that's going to be very open and target capabilities. It's supposed to replace one or more of the GWACs out there, which are by their nature are restrictive. This is going to be an open procurement. It probably will have this. They've done some RFIs already. I think the second one's going to come out in July. But you might go on the GSA website and look for that, and you might fit into that if you're trying to find a variation from what the new GWAC's requiring on Polaris.
Who's issuing that, Tony? Is it FSS or FTS? Yeah. Or?
I think it's coming out of FSS, and I apologize. I can shoot you a note on the name of it.
Contract. Is it the Big Mac? BIC?
Yeah, yes, the Big Mac.
Yeah. So yeah, it's I think part of that is the Oasis as well. It's probably going to be non-IT from what I hear.
Oh, non-IT. Okay.
Yeah, more professional services. Yep. Thank you. I appreciate your input on that. Thank you.
Very good. Well, listen, I really would like to conclude the program. I know that we've got a few more questions up here. But I do want to thank Lisa and Tony for preparing to spend this hour with us and make it, you know, productive and with the most up-to-date information and interpreting it all. So I do thank you. I hope we'll see you again. I encourage everybody who's attended to keep in touch with the PTAC office and with Tony for much more detailed, you know, support and advice. There's definitely the value of being informed as opposed to naively going into these contracts that could, you know, make or break you really, especially for very vulnerable small businesses. So thank you very much from us, from the Post. The Board of Directors thanks you. Perhaps we can have you back again next year. I want to say thank you to Bree as well. And please tune in for our next event, which is going to be in June, one of our big events of the year. It's a joint event with ACEC and CMAA on June 23, where we'll have the Coast Guard to update us on regional and national infrastructure programs. And JETSI is ongoing, you know, next month, so we'll see you again in June. So Lisa and Tony, I don't want to keep you longer than you already have.
Well, thank you for inviting us to be
No,
on.
you were fun. It's always great. You make these topics, you know, more bearable. I mean, it's awful to have to read it and interpret it for yourself. So, you know, having your help and attention, you know, is it's priceless, really. So
Well,
thank you so much.
Thanks for
I
having
actually
us.
enjoyed myself this last hour. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
So good. Thank you all for attending, everybody.
Thank
you,
everyone
Val
for participating.
and Joe. Yeah. Bye for now.